Unfortunately, because of the time limits, I had to squeeze in the stuff, squeeze up the stuff about our book in order to leave time to spend more on the environmental connections between inequality and sustainability. I want to start, though, with this graph, which shows the connection between life expectancy and national income per person. This is not ash from a factory chimney or something, it's the names of countries. And what it shows is there are very rapid rises in economic growth, in life expectancy in the early stages of economic growth, and then it levels off. And the important thing about that is that it's a very similar picture if instead of looking at life expectancy, you look at happiness or measures of well-being, you get those rapid rises in the early stages of economic growth and then leveling out. And that's a curve of diminishing returns to economic growth. You know, it's really important to have more if you're in one of the poorer countries where many people still haven't got the basic necessities. But having more and more of everything makes less and less difference. And actually you can see that you start to reach the sort of levels of life expectancy we have somewhere around here. Costa Rica, Cuba, Chile, you see countries like that. The UK, you probably can't see it, I haven't got a pointer. That means that if we do have to have sacrifice economic growth, that we're not really sacrificing the real important gains that economic growth has brought. You know, it is what's transformed the quality of human life. And yet, we've got far beyond the levels of consumption that we need to sustain our high living standard, our high levels of life expectancy, happiness, or sense of well-being. And of course, if you look at that same thing, instead of GNP per capita along the bottom, carbon emissions along the bottom, it's you can see it's a very similar picture. We're consuming or emitting vastly more carbon than we need to get our high levels of life expectancy. Really important, because people always think that if we have to do without growth or have less growth, that this is a huge sacrifice of real human progress. This graph is just blowing up the countries that were on the top right-hand part of the not with the bombs, it's just expanding. So here you've got that same thing, life expectancy against national income, and you can see there's absolutely no relationship at all between the two. The countries on the right are twice as rich as the ones on the left, and it makes no difference to life expectancy at all. No suggestion of a connection. Yet you all know that life expectancy is worst in the poorest areas of our societies, in the inner cities and so on, in the most deprived areas. And indeed, within our societies, there are these extraordinary social gradients in health, right across society. These are electoral wards of England and Wales, arranged by levels of deprivation. My side, the most deprived wards, with life expectancy, well, this is old data, so it's 71.5. These figures, think of all those bars as being a little higher now. The least deprived with about 8 years longer. That's actually, I think, the biggest human rights abuse in the modern world, in modern societies, in the rich societies. But look, it's not a difference between the poor and the rest of society. This isn't about poverty, because even the people just below the top have less good health than the people at the top. We are all part of this pattern of health inequalities. As Michael Marmot often says, you can take away all the problem of poverty and poor health, and you've still got most of the problem of health inequalities left. But you see, there's a real paradox. Income, or something like it, is very important within our society, but it doesn't make any difference between societies. You can double life expectancy for everyone and it doesn't help. And yet within societies it's so important. That's a paradox. And the explanation of that paradox is within our society we're dealing with measures, we're looking at relative income, social status, social position, where we are in relation to each other, and the size of the gaps between us. And so again, although things are worse in the poorest areas of our society, don't think that that is an indication of our need for economic growth. It's not. It's misunderstanding the problem. The problem now in the rich world is the differences between us. And having understood that that's about social position or relative income, you should immediately start thinking, okay, what happens if you stretch out the income differences or squash them up a bit? Instead of treating that as a sort of hypothetical question, we've taken measures of income differences between rich and poor in each country, each of the rich developed countries, the ones I showed you earlier, comparing the top 20% in each country with the bottom 20%. And you can see in the most equal, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden on the left, the top 20% in each of those countries is 3.5 or 4 times as rich as the bottom 20%. That's the size of the gap. But in the more unequal countries, UK, Portugal, USA, the gap is twice as big. We are twice as unequal as those societies. Canada, where Peter was speaking from just now, is just right in the middle. So what does it do to a society to have those bigger or smaller income differences? That's really what I'm going to show you in a very collapsed form. We got together internationally comparable data on as many of these problems. Well, I should say that people call our book a theory of everything because we do talk about drug problems and violence and teenage births and life expectancy and mental illness and goodness knows what. So they call it a theory of everything. It's not a theory of everything. It's a theory of problems which become more common at the bottom of the social ladder. You know, drug problems and violence exist at the top, but they're more common at the bottom. And you can look at those social gradients and you can think, well, you know, maybe they're a result of social mobility. The vulnerable, the people with problems move down, and the resilient, the ones without, move up. And so we get a social gradient. But I'm going to show you those problems are, well, I won't have time to show you most of the data, but anything from twice as common to 10 times as common in countries with bigger differences between rich and poor. I'm also going to show you it's not the bricks and mortar, it's not the material circumstances themselves that are doing the damage. It's the differences between us. So we collected internationally comparable data on as many of those problems with social gradients as we could get good comparable data on. So you can get life expectancy for each country. Kids' maths and literacy scores, OECD has them. Infant mortality rates, homicide rates in proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, levels of trust, it's how much people feel they can trust others, obesity rates, mental illness, which come from WHO and include drug and alcohol addiction, and some figures on social mobility in each country. We put them all together in one index, our index of health and social problems. They're all weighted equally. Where we use indexes, we don't show numbers up the side because the units are standard deviation units, which most people don't understand. And you see there that extraordinarily close relationship, that tendency for countries with greater inequality on that measure of inequality I've just shown you to do worse on all those kinds of things. And yet, if you put that same index, those same figures for each country up the side, but now in relation to national income per person, there's no relationship. We were worried that people would think we'd chosen these things in our index to suit the argument. And you can see that most of the serious problems with social gradients that you might expect to find internationally comparable data for are there. But we decided to deal with that, you know, because people are, some of them think greater equality is the most dastardly suggestion ever. So we looked at the UNICEF index of child well-being, which other people made up. We can't be accused of rigging it. It has 40 different components. As far as I know, people hadn't beforehand ever looked at it in relation to inequality. We published a paper in the British Medical Journal doing that. Its components include almost every aspect of child well-being. So whether kids can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying in schools, how they do in these international maths and literacy tests, what immunization rates are like, whether kids have books at home. All that goes into it. One of the measures actually is the proportion of kids in relative poverty in each country, and as that's so like a measure of inequality, we took that out so people wouldn't say this was a circular argument. Here is that UNICEF index of child well-being in relation to income inequality. It's a highly significant, statistically significant relationship, not as tight as the earlier ones. But look, if you take that same index of child well-being and show it not in relation to inequality, but in relation to national income per person, there's nothing there at all. People endlessly talk about child poverty, and they don't distinguish between relative and absolute poverty. So we're left not knowing whether what we need is more economic growth to lift children out of poverty, or whether what we need is redistribution. The evidence is very, very clear. What we need is redistribution. The problem is how far behind the rest of society children are falling. How unequal is the society they're growing up in. That's what matters. I would love to take you through all the separate components of that index as I usually do. I'm just going to show you one or two of them. This is trust from the World Values Survey. It's a proportion of people who agree that most people can be trusted. And it's at the more unequal societies, it falls to about 15% of the population who feel they can trust others, and it rises among the more equal countries to 60 or 65%. Huge differences. If I showed you measures of social capital, the sort of thing Putnam put together in his Bowling Alone, or his earlier book, Making Democracy Work, his study of the Italian regions, close relationships with inequality. That intuition that people have that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive is what the data is actually showing is true. All these measures of trust, involvement in community life, social cohesion, all show that inequality is indeed divisive and corrosive. We've done all this work twice. We did it on these rich developed countries, and then we repeated it all on the 50 American states, wanting a quite independent test bed to see if the same picture emerges. The relationships are very, very similar. In the book we show on each health and social problem relationships amongst the 50 states, the relationships internationally, and nearly everything which is significantly related to inequality internationally is also significantly related to inequality amongst the American states. And here's just one example. This is, again, trust, this time from the federal government's General Social Survey in the States. These are the American states. And you see, it doesn't fall quite as low, nearly as low, and it rises to a very similar level. It's a very similar scatter. You can see basically the same thing is going on with trust in relation to inequality amongst the American states, as I showed you internationally. This one, just to give you a feel of the data, is teenage birth rates. This is births per 1,000 women in their teens. And it goes from about 5 births per 1,000 women at the most equal end up to, well, the UK there you see just above 30, so that's 6 times as high, and the USA 10 times as high as the most equal societies. Huge differences in these outcomes. This one's violence. This isn't our data. This is Daly and Wilson, and those dots are American states. Down at the bottom left you can see a few triangles. Those are the Canadian provinces. Daly and Wilson are Canadian at McMaster, and I suspect that's why they put the Canadian provinces in. Homicide rates. Again, look at the differences. The more equal end, it's about 15 homicides per million, and it goes up to 150. The differences in our book are less dramatic because we're showing everything using the same measure of inequality, the same group of countries. And our critics, pretend that we are the only people who've ever suggested there's anything wrong with inequality, and they pick off a few countries and suggest that, say, okay, the relationship isn't significant anymore. there are 50 studies of violence in relation to inequality in different settings. It doesn't make any difference whether, you know, how it pans out in our data. There was a review in 1993 of 34 studies, and there have been many more since then, and that review said it was a robust relationship. So anyway, close relationships with a lot of these different things. This one, just this last of them, is social mobility, showing that social mobility is higher in the more equal countries. It looks as if the amount of inequality in outcome is one of the most powerful determinants of the scale of social mobility and equal opportunity. For people to say that equal opportunity or giving children an equal chance justifies inequality is absurd. You know, here the USA, the land of opportunity, is actually the land of least opportunity. My co-author Kate sometimes says that if the Americans want to live the American dream, they should go to Denmark. I may say this is income-related mobility. It's basically asking whether rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons, or whether there's no or little predictive power in fathers' incomes. And so in the USA and UK, fathers' income matters much more than in Finland, Denmark, those countries. And to avoid showing you all the stuff, this is correlations between inequality, income inequality, internationally and amongst the American states and the various components of our index. You see the almost always highly significant correlations. That one that isn't for the US, mental illness, not quite significant. It is for women and it is for children, but not for men. So inequality is a very profound influence on all sorts of measures, not just soft, subjective measures of what's going on in a society and whether people say they're happy or not, but actually hard measures of well-being, like death rates and violence and teenage births. I will just want to make this one point, because before I move on to environmental issues, I think often people think that, okay, if more unequal countries do worse on these problems that are more common amongst the poor, that must be because they have more poor. That's not necessarily the explanation. It's actually only a small contributor. The main reason why our societies have become more unequal over the last generation is that the top incomes have been running away from the rest of us, not because there's been more poverty. But you can see it's not just the poor who are being affected by inequality from the scale of differences. I've been pointing out differences, well, I didn't show you mental illness 3 times as common in the more unequal countries, teenage birth rates 10 times as common, proportion of the population in prison 10 times as high. Huge differences. The smallest, I think, is infant mortality, where it's only twice as high in more unequal countries. And the differences are so big because it is not driven just by the poorest 10% of the population. We're all affected by inequality. Like that social gradient in life expectancy I showed you in areas of England and Wales, it runs right across society, and so do the effects of inequality. But you don't just have to infer that we all benefit from greater equality from that kind of consideration. There are some studies that allow us to see at different points in the social hierarchy how more and less equal countries compare. So this is infant mortality. Again, it's old data when people were first interested in comparing health inequalities internationally. Some Swedes classified a lot of their infant deaths according to our British Registrar General's occupational class classification. From social class 1 at the top, the professional occupations, doctors, lawyers, directors of larger companies, down through to class 5, unskilled manual workers, and single parents go in a group on their own because anachronistically it's a classification by father's occupation. But you can see the Swedes do better right across the board. Even in social class 1, the Swedes do better. The difference is the biggest at the bottom, and it tapers off, but still exists at the top. And the paper on adult mortality showed just the same thing. We have 5 graphs in our book that show the same pattern, whether we compare more and less equal American states or more and less equal countries, or Britain and the United States, or the United States still a bit more unequal. The benefits of greater equality, all of them show that they go right across society. Some colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health, using more sophisticated methods, multi-level models and so on, said that inequality is a general social pollutant because its effects go so far up the income scale. So now, equality and sustainability. There are a number of really important connections between the two. One of the problems about getting old is that you forget what slides come next. So from now on I'm going to be surprised by each slide. Oh yes. This is really to illustrate that the first really important connection between inequality and sustainability is that the biggest threat, if you like, to sustainability is consumerism. But consumerism is intensified by greater inequality. You know, it's driven by status competition and intensified by more inequality. In more unequal societies, there's more status competition, more status insecurity. We judge each other more by status. And some of the indications are that in more unequal countries, people work longer hours, up to 2 months a year longer, the equivalent of 2 months a year. They save less of their income, they spend more, they get into debt more. And they do that because money is even more important in a more unequal society. It shows what you're worth. It's how you show people whether you're success or failure, whether you're any good. It's what you use the consumer goods to speak for you, to show your value. Consumerism, I think, is driven by people not feeling valued. So if we're going to reduce consumerism, we need to reduce one of the really powerful drivers of it, inequality. The next really, let me stop for a moment there. The next really important connection between the two, I think, is that more equal societies are more public-spirited, more aware of the common good, if you like. And if we're going to reduce carbon emissions, move towards sustainability, that means a sense of the greater good. It's dependent on us working for the greater good of humanity, actually. And we thought that more equal societies were probably more public-spirited because we knew that the measures of social cohesion, social capital and trust were stronger in more equal societies. People have more to do with each other. And so we started to look at a few outcomes which might be indicative of that. And first, we found that more equal countries give more in foreign aid. And, if you want to predict whether countries are going to be keen on pursuing these environmental agreements, which are key to global survival, then that might be a good indicator. We also had some friends, Roberto De Vogli and a friend of his, directed us to this survey, an international survey of opinions of business leaders, and one of the questions they were asked was how important they thought it was that their governments should comply with international environmental agreements. And you see again a very close relationship, a highly significant tendency for more equal countries. Business leaders think that environmental issues are more important. In more unequal countries, I think people just feel they're out for themselves. You've got to fight your own corner. And they have less to do with each other if you measure these, using these measures of involvement in community life. More equal countries also recycle more. This is a measure of, I think, 5 different waste materials that we put into one index, and again, high recycling amongst the more equal countries. So I think that's another important link, that those societies are better, are more able to act for the common good. One of the really key problems that, of course, Peter was in his lecture addressing is this issue that, well, Murray Bookchin put it like this, that capitalism can no more be persuaded to limit growth than a human being can be persuaded to stop breathing. You know, in capitalism, growth seems absolutely essential to business profits and a sense of whether a director has done a good job. I think even in university departments, academics rate themselves by whether they've increased the size of their department, got more research workers, and so on. Using growth as the measure of ourselves is very fundamental, and it is built into some of these processes. But interestingly, Henry Wallach, who was former governor of the US Federal Reserve Bank and then professor of economics at Yale, said growth is a substitute for equality of income. So long as there is growth, there is hope, he said, and that makes large income differences tolerable. He means that people can feel sort of life is improving, they're living better than their parents and so on because of economic growth. And you know, we think of relativities not only in terms of other people, but in terms of the past over time, and we feel that things are improving, and so inequality becomes more tolerable. But you can swap that around. If we're going to do without growth, then the amount of inequality, I suspect, will become intolerable. We need to reduce inequality if we're going to reduce growth. I think that's a really important connection. In our data, we see that there are 2 quite different ways of becoming more equal. There are societies like Sweden which have very big differences in earnings and redistribute with high taxes and benefits, a big welfare state. But then there are countries like Japan that are just as equal, which have smaller differences in incomes to start with. And before taxes and lower taxes. We find the same contrast amongst the American states. Some of the more equal ones start off with small income differences before taxes and have very low taxes. Others do it through redistribution. And it looks as if it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you become more equal somehow. The benefits seem to be the same, whichever the route. I think at the moment the political climate makes it very difficult to try and raise income taxes, though I do wish, of course, Cameron would deal with the deficit more by raising taxes on the better off than through cuts. I think there is some scope for campaigning against tax avoidance amongst the rich, tax avoidance by companies. That's a slightly easier target. But I think that perhaps the best way is through increased economic democracy of all kinds. I suspect that the bonus culture, those obscenely high salary levels at the top, reflect people at the top feeling they don't have to answer to anyone. They can do just what they like. Interesting when you compare the John Lewis, where yesterday I think it was announced they're all going to get another 9 weeks' pay because the bonus is redistributed in the whole company through all employees. They get another 9 weeks' pay. In some companies that would have gone mainly to a few directors. Actually, the directors get it whether their company has been more profitable or not. And it's bizarre. There seems to be so little connection between these bonuses and company performance. But you see, even if you did win greater equality through changes in taxes and benefits, it's very vulnerable to another government coming along and at the stroke of a pen undoing it all. We have to get equality more deeply embedded in our society. And how we rein in that bonus culture is by making people at the top more answerable to other people. Whether it's by having employee or trade union representatives on the board, as I think the EU social chapter requires, or whether it's other more thoroughgoing forms of economic democracy, like employee-owned companies, cooperatives, or mutuals or friendly societies. You know, all those kinds of organizations, some of them have large-ish differentials, but they're nothing like as large as the companies that don't have those elements of democracy. We in the Equality Trust are in the process of trying to see whether it would be feasible to establish a consumer movement rather like fair trade, but favouring these kinds of companies. So the advantages of those kind of companies that they do have smaller pay differences. I suspect they're less addicted to growth, and that they're more consistent with a local steady state economy. And that if you own your company as employees, you're not going to vote for your jobs to go to the other side of the world where labour is cheaper. So I think it's a way of partially dealing with that problem. It's also a way of dealing with our loss of community. People endlessly think of loss of community in residential areas. People don't know their neighbours anymore. But it's at work that we have most to do with each other, most connection with each other. But it's at work that we are most divided by hierarchy, you know, with chains of command and line managers and so on. It's also where the inequality is first created by the, you know, not only is wealth created at work, but it's divided first at work. So we must bring that under more democratic control. And even if it's only very indirect control, you probably don't think and you might think your boss should get twice as much as you, maybe 5 times as much. You probably don't think they should get 400 times as much that they do in some of these big companies. So I think that you can, and what we've got to do is to create a movement with a clear sense of the kind of society we need to be moving towards. A society that can solve the environmental problems, which can solve many of these social problems. In a sense, what's been coming out of the social epidemiology, as we understand how important the psychosocial influences on death rates are, working through chronic stress, is the importance of the social environment. Both things to do with social status and things to do with friendship are really important to health. And I sometimes think rather as, you know, there were studies of weight gain in babies that showed that babies need more than just feeding. They need that detailed interaction, involvement, handling, eye contact, and so on from a loving parent. And a lot of the epidemiology looking at the determinants of health in the rich countries is showing us the unanswered social needs of adults. And the kind of society we should be moving towards, i.e. the more equal societies, where stronger social bonds, friendship and so on, which is such a powerful influence on health. A recent review of studies of friendship and health, a meta-analysis of 150 studies looking at friendship and health, found that in a follow-up period, survival in that follow-up period is more strongly influenced by friendship, whether you have more or fewer friends, than by whether or not you smoke. It's not a wishy-washy kind of influence on health. It's absolutely fundamental, and increasingly we know how chronic stress leads to, affects the immune system and cardiovascular system. So I think that the easiest way of communicating this is to form an inspiring idea of the society we need to be moving towards, in which the quality of life is better for all of us. I briefly showed you that greater equality is beneficial to the vast majority of the population, but I think I was going to do some research on employee-owned companies, and I visited a few. I didn't get the money, but I visited a couple that had been through employee buyouts fairly recently, and people said it changes a company from being a piece of property into a community. There's this bizarre pattern that increasingly the value of a company is not the plant, equipment, buildings, it's the group of employees brought together in that company, working together. And the idea of buying and selling a group of people, which is, or external shareholders owning that group of people, it's absolutely bizarre. We've got to move beyond that. We know what went wrong with state ownership of the means of production, but there is this other model that we really must pursue. We're not going to solve these problems in a year or two by tweaking benefits or whatever a little bit. We've got to have a view of a quite different society that we should be moving towards, and see how work can be transformed, how, as Peter said, we need to be moving towards a leisure society. The New Economics Foundation suggests we should be moving towards a 21-hour week, with time for friends and family and community, taking the benefits of productivity out in terms of more leisure rather than higher standards of consumption. But also, digitization is a really exciting possibility, because the marginal costs of anything that can be digitally reproduced, whether it's computer games, films, all the written and spoken word, we can all have it virtually for free. We have to go on paying the producers, but once it's been written or filmed or whatever it is, performed, everyone can have it. And so there's a huge area of cultural creation, productivity, which is moving into the sphere of being a public good. So that too should go into our box of the kind of society we should be moving towards. And it's also a great step towards greater equality, because if that, all those things are no longer allocated by income, we're making progress. I know I've run out of my time.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you for the thoughtful and very engaging presentation.